What's a conspiracy theory that later got proven to be true? The Bruce McArthur story is a weird one. For 7 years there was a conspiracy theory of a serial killer specifically targeting gay men around Toronto was floating around, but it could never be proven, until eventually enough evidence came up implicating him and he got caught in a sting operation. Armstrong was using an elaborate international blood transfusion scheme to cheat at bike racing. The fall of Lance Armstrong was something else. He went from a superhuman, cancer-surviving world champion to a doper who kept getting caught and trying to lie his way out of it. Jeffrey Epstein was trafficking women and children for some very elite people on a temple island. Crazy but true. You know, I remember reading that Hunter S. Thompson was working on the story of his lifetime, one that involved a child pedophilia ring that involved many of the world's most powerful people and that it ran all the way up to the White House during the Bush Sr. administration. Before he could publish the story, he was found having committed suicide. Many of his friends and family had publicly questioned the suicide, in part because Thompson had said he was worried about being taken out in just such a way. I have a feeling that he was pulling on some threads that would have led to this whole Epstein ring. People forget that Thompson was an actual journalist. Project MK Ultra. The CIA really was experimenting on unsuspecting citizens to determine the effects of LSD, specifically as relates to mind control. My mother tells me of how my grandfather was one of those test subjects in a local psychiatric hospital. She also told me that the doctor who administered the study later committed suicide. My mother also was. It's a long ducking story. Turned out her dad was CIA, which nobody knew until his death, and then his children were informed in person. He was recruited out of the Navy in World War II. He ostensibly was a geologist who spent months at a time out of touch, in places like Nicaragua, Beirut, Saudi Arabia and other parts of Central America. Anyway, he had close ties to an institute that, indeed, has been confirmed in mainstream media years later to be part of the MK Ultra studies. My mother was taken there as an older child, or maybe young teen, and they took a picture of her covertly. There were tons of two-way mirrors, apparently. She was then shown a picture of another child and asked who it was. Of course, she didn't know. This process was repeated multiple times, but each time, a bit more of the photo would be morphed with the one they took of her. Finally, they showed her the one of just her, and she didn't recognize herself. Her mother was held at the institute for months, shortly after that. She wasn't told why, allowed phone calls and no explanation was given. This was repeated numerous times and my mom got the sheet beaten out of her anytime she asked what was going on. Anyway, my aunt, who was a kid at the time, found my grandmother dead in the house one afternoon. No cause of death was ever given, no autopsy, nothing. She was in her early 40s. There's a whole lot more weird shit beyond that, but that's the MK Ultra bit. Interestingly, Mom had never heard of MK Ultra and was just sharing a weird anecdote about her childhood. She just about fainted when I googled the name of the institute and showed her the link between the place she was taken, her father's work and what she experienced. Government surveillance is the most obvious one. They're charging the birds as we speak. Jimmy Savile being a pedophile. John Lydon from Sex Pistols even came forward in the 90s and spoke about it on radio 20 years before the public found out. Rosemary Kennedy was shut away from society because of a botched lobotomy. Her family didn't know about it for 20 years. The Lincoln assassination. That was a true conspiracy, with shadowy meetings and plans and everything. Besides Lincoln, they planned to kill the VP Johnson and Secretary of State Seward. Unlike movie conspirators, most of these guys were dolts. The VP assassin chickened out. Seward's would-be assassin succeeded in seriously wounding him but failed to kill him. JWB succeeded but was caught and killed a couple weeks later. They were all rounded up, and in the heat of the times were executed. Even Mary Surratt, who owned the boarding house where they met, was hanged. The doctor who set Boo's leg, broken during the escape, got 20 years in prison. People don't think of it as a classic conspiracy, because there wasn't a government or state-sponsored hand behind it. Try as they might, the feds could never find any proof that the Confederate leadership had anything to do with it. But it was a conspiracy nonetheless. They were going to kill everyone in the line of succession up to Secretary of War Stanton. Crucial pages from Booth's diary were removed and destroyed. There are a whole bunch of evidence. By the way, did you know that all of the conspirators were in the crowd viewing Lincoln's inauguration and are identifiable in the photograph? No one gonna bring up Operation Sea Spray? The Navy was testing bacterial weaponry in 1950 on San Francisco. They released pathogens off the shore and calculated that there was enough for the whole population to get a dose. Caused a spike in urinary tract infections and a guy died. So not to minimize the severity, but it kinda gave me a chuckle when you end with one guy died, because it doesn't seem serious but it really is. A rival of Thomas Jefferson revealed to the press that Jefferson had had an affair and several children with an enslaved person he owned, Sally Hemings, who was actually his late wife's half-sister. It was adamantly denied by the Jefferson family and historic foundations until recent DNA testing revealed it had been true. Somewhat related, President Harding was a horndog who had a ton of affairs that were largely covered up. In particular, he had a child with Nan Britton, which came out I believe after his death, and Britton was attacked over it constantly and nobody believed her. I mean, they were cruel. I think it's fair to say they ruined her life over it. Much later DNA testing was done, and what do you know, it was the truth. That the FBI spied on Ernest Hemingway. So I'm reading a book on this right now and his life was extremely interesting. He was a ploy for the communists because he sympathized so heavily with the working man, but he refused to call himself a communist because he was pretty unpolitical. But while he was covering the Spanish Civil War, he was unknowingly shooting communist propaganda films that were very popular in the US and with the president at the time. The book hasn't covered the actual surveillance, but it's written by a CIA researcher who mentions how thick Hemingway's file was in the foreword. Writer, sailor, soldier, spy by Nicholas Reynolds. That China harvests organs from their prisoners. The first rumors came out in the early 2000s, but everyone dismissed it since it came from Falun Gong practitioners, which were like a Chinese Buddhist cult. If you lived in any major city, you'd see them passing out flyers and protesting in front of Chinese embassies and no one believed them. 20 years later, we all know it to be true. Did you know that this was also speculated on in WWZ, the book, as part of how the Z virus spread, which may also be true for the current situation? So many things in that book have serious, weird parallels with what's actually happened with coronavirus. Without getting into too many spoilers, it starts in central China, about 500 miles from Wuhan, which is later mentioned, and there is an initial cover-up. The initial mixed response: Phalanx, Cuba, North Korea, celebrities on video, South Korea. Obviously not perfect parallels in some of those, but it's funny how close a book released 15 years ago has gotten to a lot of this. Panama Papers. This was forgotten so quickly. Not forgotten, just ignored. It may seem unthinkable now, but just a few decades ago the idea that the Catholic Church was knowingly harboring pedophiles among its ranks, and would move those child molesters to different locations with fresh victims when the people at their current location became suspicious, was thought to be a conspiracy theory only believed by total tinfoil hat nutcases. Shame it turned out to be horribly true. And the Catholic Church still hasn't cleaned up their act. If the choir boys are in less danger now, it's not because the church has cracked down on the predators, it's because normal people now know not to leave their kid alone with Father McFeely. Apple slows down older iPhones with software updates. They said it was to help reduce the load on the batteries as they lose performance with age, so a slower phone would make the batteries last longer. Not sure if legit or just taking advantage of that quirk in batteries and overestimating the benefit of their solution. It's a bit of a weird one because generally if a phone is that old, the battery is probably knackered and slowing down the processor will help that. It probably would give a better overall experience for the typical old phone user. Now the real issue was transparency. If they'd said they were doing it and made an easy opt-out, then everyone would have been fine with it. Either you agree it's a benefit or you can turn it off. I am not really a big believer they did it to get people to buy new phones. Most people it affected probably weren't buying phones brand new anyway. But I guess we'll never really know. 30 years ago my aunt and uncle, educated scientists, told me that Harvard and the other Ivy Leagues had a secret quota they used to keep Asians limited. I stupidly thought this was crazy because I was repeatedly told affirmative action can only help you, not hurt you. And here we are. I've heard that calculations show that if affirmative action rules are lifted, whites would massively drop from universities because South Asian and East Asian students would increase. That Michael Jackson's father had him chemically castrated. His doctor confirmed it after his death. Probably the most recent one that we didn't have enough time to label as a conspiracy theory was a couple of months ago, when AI firms started picking up anomalous spikes in pneumonia-related deaths and started talking about the fact that there is another, unknown pandemic going on that's killing people but mislabeled as pneumonia. Edit. Here is an article about how a Canadian startup spotted it 9 days before WHO announced the pandemic. My comment about is mainly conjecture, but I think it is very plausible that Blue Dot is not the only startup research group picked up on the fact that something is going on. Most of us, including myself, have anecdotes regarding themselves or relatives going through horrible illnesses late 19. There is meaningful trends in retrospect, so there must be trends back then that must have triggered something, any statistical engine analyzing the data, if any. Edit 2, Theodolf also shared some more sources on the subject. Edit 3. Here is another link from U.K. Casper. That's interesting. But this would have to have been back in November or December, right? We've known about the coronavirus all year. That we've had a female president before. There was a theory that Roosevelt was ill and bedridden for the latter part of his second term in office and that his wife was secretly running the show, making most of the decisions. Turns out it was true. Many people who were part of Roosevelt's staff at the time admitted it years later. Look into the last few months of President Wilson's life. He was a vegetable, and his doctor and wife were gatekeeping and making decisions in his name.